Hey guys, welcome aboard to Just Sleep Stories. Tonight we're cracking open one of the most delicious conspiracies in corporate history, the story of Coca-Cola, cocaine, and the soft drink that casually addicted half of America while wearing the smile of a friendly neighborhood beverage. That's right. The world's most beloved fizzy sugar water used to have actual cocaine in it. Not metaphorical cocaine. Not, "This is so good it feels like cocaine." Literal, extracted from coca leaves, make your dentist nervous cocaine. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Somehow, it's always 2 in the morning and you're lying there watching your ceiling fan and wondering why your brain won't shut off. Well, we have something for that tonight. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what Coca-Cola tasted like when it still had cocaine in it? Did people in the 1880s know they were addicted, or did they just think they really loved soda? Was there a moment where someone at the Coca-Cola company thought, should we maybe not put cocaine in the children's drink? Did the marketing team just ignore that? Who was the first person to notice that every time they had a Coke they felt inexplicably confident and ready to give a 3-hour speech? Was the original slogan just, Coca-Cola, you'll feel amazing and you won't know why? And how exactly does a product that started as a cocaine-laced patent medicine sold out of a pharmacy in Atlanta, Georgia, end up being served at every birthday party, every fast food restaurant, and every vending machine in every airport on the entire planet? And now, congratulations, you've just woken up in Atlanta, Georgia, in the year 1886. It is warm. It is humid. Someone nearby is selling something out of a glass jug, and whatever is in that jug, people keep coming back for more, a lot more. Let's set the scene. It's the 1880s, and if you have a headache, a stomachache, a broken heart, or simply a vague sense that life is exhausting, there is one place you go, the pharmacy. Not for anything as modern as an actual diagnosis. No, you go to buy a mysterious brown bottle with a confident label that promises it will cure everything from fatigue to female hysteria to brain fog, which incidentally is also what they called being a person in the 1880s. This was the golden age of patent medicines, a time when any man with a jug, a label, and absolutely zero medical training could bottle something foul, slap the word tonic on it, and sell it to an enthusiastically desperate public. Into this glorious chaos walked one John Stith Pemberton, a pharmacist from Columbus, Georgia, a Civil War veteran with a morphine addiction, a genuinely creative mind, and an extremely optimistic relationship with the word remedy. Patent medicines were not, to be clear, actual patents. They were called that because the original English versions had received royal patents, official endorsements from the Crown, back in the 17th century. By the 1880s, the name had simply stuck, even though the products had about as much royal endorsement as a handwritten sign in a market stall. What they did have was extraordinary marketing. Bottles came wrapped in testimonials. Advertisements in newspapers promised miraculous recoveries from conditions that may or may not have existed. And the secret ingredient in most of them, the thing that made customers feel better, at least temporarily, and come back for more, was usually alcohol, opium, morphine, or some combination of the three. The medicine wasn't curing anything. It was simply making people feel too good to care. Pemberton understood this world intimately, both as a pharmacist and as a customer. He had been prescribed morphine after being wounded at the Battle of Columbus near the end of the Civil War, and like hundreds of thousands of other veterans, he had never quite managed to stop using it. Morphine addiction was so common among Civil War veterans that it was sometimes called the soldier's disease, and there was almost no social infrastructure to address it, no rehabilitation programs, no understanding of addiction as a medical condition, and no effective alternative painkiller. You were simply a person who needed morphine, and you either found a way to keep obtaining it, or you suffered. What Pemberton wanted to do, genuinely, earnestly, was solve this problem, not just for himself, but commercially. He had already produced and sold several patent medicines, including a product called Globe of Flower Cough Syrup, and another called Triplex Liver Pills, which tells you everything you need to know about the naming conventions of the era. He had an inventor's restlessness and a chemist's curiosity, and he had been watching the cocaine-based patent medicines arriving from Europe with great professional interest. If cocaine could do what wine and morphine were doing, but without the legal complications of alcohol and the stigma increasingly attaching to opium products, then cocaine might be the future of the therapeutic beverage market. He was not wrong about the market. He was not entirely right about the solution, but he was undeniably onto something. The pharmacy in the 1880s was less a place of healing and more a place of hopeful chemistry, a room full of glass bottles and ambitious promises, presided over by men who were doing their best with what they had. And what Pemberton had, as he began mixing and testing and refining, was a very specific idea about what the perfect tonic should feel like. Sharp, energizing, slightly mysterious, something that made you feel, for a few bright minutes, like the world was entirely manageable. He was describing cocaine, of course, but he was also, without knowing it yet, describing Coca-Cola. Here is a fact that history books tend to gloss over with the quiet dignity of someone changing the subject at a dinner party. The man who invented Coca-Cola was trying to cure his own drug addiction. John Pemberton had become dependent on morphine after being wounded during the Civil War, a fate shared by hundreds of thousands of veterans at the time. Morphine was handed out by army surgeons the way breath mints are handed out today, casually, enthusiastically, and with very little concern for what happened next. So Pemberton, trained as a pharmacist and wired as an inventor, did what any reasonable, slightly desperate entrepreneurial man of the 1880s would do. He decided to invent a better drug to replace the drug he was addicted to. The fact that this new drug would also be cocaine is a detail that seemed entirely reasonable to everyone involved. To understand why replacing morphine with cocaine seemed like a good idea in 1885, you have to understand what cocaine was considered to be at the time. It was new, it was exciting. It had just been synthesized in a pure form by European chemists, and the early medical reports were, from a certain optimistic angle, genuinely promising. Sigmund Freud, published a paper in 1884 called Über Coca, in which he enthusiastically described cocaine as a treatment for morphine and alcohol addiction, depression, digestive disorders, and general fatigue. He was wrong about most of this, but the paper was taken seriously by the medical establishment because it was written by Sigmund Freud, and because the medical establishment of 1884 was working with significantly less information than we have now. Pemberton read papers like Freud's. He corresponded with other pharmacists. He attended trade conferences. He was a well-connected, professionally engaged member of the pharmaceutical community, and the professional community was, at this precise moment in history, genuinely excited about coca leaf extracts. The leap from cocaine as medicine to cocaine as the active ingredient in my new therapeutic tonic was not, in the context of 1885, an unusual or reckless one. It was, if anything, entrepreneurially logical. The personal dimension made it urgent. Morphine addiction is not a comfortable condition to manage. It involves physical dependence, withdrawal symptoms that range from unpleasant to agonizing, and a daily negotiation between needing the drug and hating the need. Pemberton had been living this negotiation for years, and cocaine in those early trials did seem to blunt the morphine cravings, at least in the short term. The fact that it was also producing its own form of dependence was not yet understood. Not because the scientists were foolish, but because cocaine dependency operates on a different and initially subtler timeline than opioid dependency. So Pemberton mixed his syrup. He tried it himself. He found that it made him feel better, sharper, clearer, more capable, less tormented by whatever the morphine withdrawal had left behind. It worked, at least in the way that things work when you are solving one problem by introducing another one you do not yet recognise as a problem. And it tasted, according to the people at Jacob's Pharmacy who tried it that spring afternoon in 1886, genuinely good, which meant it was going to sell. And selling, for a man who was increasingly sick and increasingly desperate for both income and relief, was the entire point. Before Pemberton invented anything, the blueprint already existed, and it was French, which should surprise nobody. In 1863, a Corsican chemist named Angelo Mariani created a product called Vin Mariani, a Bordeaux wine infused with coca leaves from Peru. It was elegant. It was European. It was, by all accounts, absolutely extraordinary. Pope Leo XIII reportedly carried a personal hip flask of the stuff and awarded Mariani a gold medal. Thomas Edison said it helped him stay awake and work. Ulysses S. Grant, dying of throat cancer, reportedly drank it while writing his memoirs. The list of famous endorsers reads like a fever dream. H.G. Wells, Jules Verne, Queen Victoria, assorted royalty, and enough popes to make you question what exactly was being served at the Vatican. The coca leaves steeped in the wine released cocaine into the alcohol, which then crossed the blood-brain barrier with the enthusiasm of someone who just arrived at a party and immediately started talking to everyone. It was a hit. A historic, planetary, embarrassingly successful hit. And Pemberton was watching. Mariani was not a reckless man. He was, by the standards of his era, a fairly rigorous one. He had studied the uses of coca leaves in South America, where they had been chewed by indigenous Andean peoples for thousands of years as an altitude remedy, an energy booster, and a ceremonial substance, and he had concluded that their active properties could be stabilized and extracted by steeping them in wine. The wine served two functions. It acted as a solvent, drawing the cocaine alkaloids out of the leaf, and it provided a socially respectable delivery mechanism. This was not a street drug. It was a wine, a French wine. You drank it from a glass, in a drawing room, preferably while discussing literature. The dosage was not trivial. Each fluid ounce of Vin Mariani contained approximately 6 milligrams of cocaine, enough to produce noticeable effects, especially in combination with the alcohol. Users reported heightened energy, improved mood, reduced hunger, and a general sense of well-being that, when it wore off, created a very strong motivation to have another glass. Mariani marketed it as a tonic for fatigue and depression, and he was spectacularly good at collecting and publishing celebrity endorsements. He compiled them into a series of albums called the Mariani Album, which were essentially the sponsored Instagram posts of the 1880s, glamorous, aspirational, and very carefully curated. The papal endorsement deserves particular attention, because it is the kind of detail that sounds like it was invented for comic effect but is entirely real. Pope Leo XIII awarded Angelo Mariani a gold medal and appeared in one of his promotional albums. A later pope, St. Pius X, was also rumoured to fortify his morning cup of something with a dash of the product. The Vatican, to be fair, has never officially confirmed these stories, but it has also never denied them with any particular urgency, which is its own kind of answer. Pemberton saw all of this and understood it clearly. Cocaine, wrapped in the right packaging and marketed to the right aspirations, was not a scandal. It was a luxury. It was something people wanted, and not just people in the shadows. The most respected figures in the world were endorsing it by name, in print, with their photographs attached. All he needed was to create his own version, preferably one that didn't require the wine, preferably one that could be sold to absolutely everyone. He had the coca leaves. He had the chemistry. What he needed next was a problem to blame on the alcohol. Here is where geography becomes destiny. Pemberton was living in Atlanta, Georgia, a city that, by the 1880s, had developed a serious philosophical disagreement with alcohol. The temperance movement, a coalition of deeply concerned citizens, fire and brimstone preachers, and people who had watched too many saloon fights, was gaining enormous traction in the American South. Fulton County, where Atlanta sits, was flirting with going completely dry. This was a problem for Pemberton, whose version of Vin Mariani was doing decent business. If alcohol became illegal, his entire enterprise evaporated. So he did what any nimble businessman does when the rules change. He pivoted. He kept the cocaine, he swapped out the wine, and he replaced it with something carbonated, something sweet, something that could be sold at a pharmacy soda fountain to absolutely anyone: men, women, children, grandmothers, the local reverend, without anyone raising so much as an eyebrow. The temperance movement of the 1880s was not the fringe phenomenon that later history sometimes makes it appear. It was mainstream, organised, and politically powerful. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, founded in 1874, had chapters in virtually every American town. Frances Willard, its most prominent leader, was one of the most famous women in America, and in the South particularly, where Protestant Christianity ran deep and the social devastation of alcohol addiction in poor communities was genuinely visible and genuinely terrible. The movement had a moral weight that was difficult to argue against. Atlanta had been flirting with prohibition since the 1870s. Fulton County held local option votes, referendums on whether to go dry, with increasing regularity. The results were close enough to keep everyone nervous. For a businessman whose product contained alcohol as its primary liquid base, this was not an abstract threat. It was an existential one. Pemberton's response was characteristically inventive. He had already been experimenting with non-alcoholic versions of his Coca formula, partly for practical reasons and partly because he had noticed something interesting. Carbonated water, when used as the base instead of wine, produced a distinctly different and arguably more pleasant sensory experience. The bubbles added a brightness. The mouthfeel was lighter. It tasted frankly more refreshing, the kind of thing you could drink in the heat of a Georgia summer and feel immediately better, which in Atlanta, where the summers are long and aggressively humid, and your options for refreshment were limited, was a significant competitive advantage. He also understood the social calculus precisely. A wine-based tonic, however refined, carried the smell of alcohol and the social coding that came with it. A carbonated soft drink served at a pharmacy soda fountain carried none of those associations. It was clean. It was modern. It was the kind of thing a respectable family could enjoy together in public, right there at the counter, without anyone wondering about anyone's character. The pharmacy, not the saloon, was the setting. The soda fountain, not the wine glass, was the vessel. The cocaine was still there. It was just invisible now, folded into a formula that looked for all the world like an innocent, effervescent refreshment. And in a culture that was actively looking for reasons to celebrate sobriety, while still desperately wanting something that made them feel good, John Pemberton had found a gap in the market the size of a continent. He would step into it with a small brown bottle of syrup and change the world, which is the kind of sentence that sounds like hyperbole until you look at the sales figures. In the spring of 1886, in the backyard of his home on Marietta Street in Atlanta, John Pemberton stood over a three-legged brass kettle and stirred what would become the most financially successful beverage recipe in human history. His formula, which he mixed himself, tested on himself, and refined with the meticulous attention of a man who understood both chemistry and the specific desires of the human nervous system, combined an extract from coca leaves, an extract from cola nuts which contain caffeine, essential oils, caramel for colour, and a rotating cast of other ingredients that Pemberton kept extremely close to his chest. He mixed the syrup by hand. He tasted it repeatedly. He brought samples to Jacob's Pharmacy on Peachtree Street, where the soda fountain clerk mixed it with carbonated water, and the reaction of the customers told him everything he needed to know. People liked it. People liked it a great deal. People came back for it, every single day. The brass kettle was not a romantic choice. It was the practical equipment of a working pharmacist, the kind of vessel used for compounding medicines, for mixing tinctures, for the ordinary daily work of turning raw ingredients into finished products. Pemberton was not a dramatic man in his working methods. He was methodical. He kept notes. He adjusted proportions. He was doing what pharmacists did, which was to combine known active ingredients in optimized ratios to produce a reliable and consistent therapeutic effect. The fact that this particular combination would make him immortal, or at least make his recipe immortal, was not something he could have predicted from inside that backyard. The essential oil blend was the most painstaking part of the formula. Pemberton was working with oils of orange, lemon, lime, nutmeg, cinnamon, and coriander, among others, trying to find a combination that was simultaneously complex and harmonious, that had depth without being overwhelming, sweetness without being cloying, and an aftertaste that left you wanting more rather than feeling satisfied. This last quality, the wanting more, was not an accident. It was the design goal. A good tonic did not leave you feeling complete. It left you feeling like another dose would be very welcome. The caramel colour was both practical and psychological. It made the drink look like medicine, dark, serious, authoritative, at a time when medicine was something people trusted more readily if it looked like it might be slightly dangerous. Clear soda water with a light syrup looked frivolous. Dark brown carbonated liquid looked therapeutic. It looked like something that was doing something. And in the world of patent medicines, looking like something was doing something was half the battle. Jacob's Pharmacy on Peachtree Street was the testing ground. Willis Venable, the soda fountain operator, mixed Pemberton's syrup with carbonated water for the first time on May 8th, 1886, a date that, in retrospect, deserves considerably more recognition than it receives. The price was 5 cents. The serving was 8 ounces. And the people who tried it came back the next day, and the day after that. In the first year, Pemberton sold approximately 9 glasses of Coca-Cola per day. He spent more on advertising that year than he made in revenue. But the trajectory was clear. Something about this particular combination of cocaine, caffeine, carbonation and sweetness had lodged itself in the human brain's reward system, like a key in a lock. He had not just mixed a drink, he had found a frequency. Let's be honest about something, because Pemberton's customers certainly were not. Cocaine feels magnificent. Not in a long-term sustainable way, and not in a way that ends well for anyone, but in the immediate short term, cocaine is the neurochemical equivalent of your brain throwing a surprise party for itself. It floods the prefrontal cortex with dopamine, blocks the reuptake of serotonin and norepinephrine, and produces a state of euphoria, confidence, heightened energy, and mental clarity that, in 1886, had no pharmaceutical competition whatsoever. You felt sharp. You felt capable. You felt like you could write 3 letters, fix the fence, have a productive conversation with your difficult neighbour, and still have energy left over for an evening stroll. For people living in a world without coffee culture, without energy drinks, without so much as a decent night's sleep on a straw mattress, the sensation must have been genuinely extraordinary. No wonder they kept coming back to the pharmacy. No wonder sales were brisk. No wonder John Pemberton thought he'd invented a medicine. The neuroscience, explained simply, works like this. Your brain uses dopamine as a reward signal. When you eat something good, accomplish something difficult, or experience something pleasurable, dopamine is released and you feel satisfaction. Cocaine hijacks this system by blocking the mechanism that clears dopamine from the synapse, meaning the reward signal keeps firing long after it should have faded. The result is an artificial and unsustainable state of elevated mood and energy. Your brain convinced it has just accomplished something extraordinary when you have, in fact, simply had a soda. The amount of cocaine in an early Coca-Cola was not large by later recreational standards. Estimates vary, but historians generally believe a serving of early Coca-Cola contained somewhere between 9 and 18 milligrams of cocaine. Not a massive dose, but enough to produce a noticeable, pleasant effect, particularly in someone who had not built up a tolerance. For a first-time customer sitting at a pharmacy soda fountain on a warm Atlanta afternoon, that first glass would have felt noticeably, memorably good. Not overwhelming, not frightening, just good. Better than expected. Better, perhaps, than anything else they had drunk that week. This is the commercial genius at the heart of Pemberton's invention, even if it was not quite intentional genius. He had created a product whose active ingredient guaranteed customer retention. You did not need to convince people to come back. The pharmacology did that for you. The 5-cent glass of Coca-Cola was, in the most literal neurological sense, its own best advertisement. And the caffeine from the cola nut extract added a second layer to this effect, a longer, slower, more sustained energy lift that continued after the sharper cocaine effect had passed. The combination was near perfect from a stimulant design perspective, producing an initial peak of elevated mood and energy, followed by a gentler extended period of alertness. In modern energy drink terms, this would be considered excellent product engineering. In 1886, it was considered a very nice tonic. People drank it in the morning. People drank it in the afternoon. People drank it whenever they felt tired, foggy, or simply as though the day needed improving. Nobody called it addiction. They called it a preference, a habit, a daily pleasure, which, depending on how generous you are feeling, is either a perfectly reasonable description or a very polite one. To understand why Coca-Cola spread so quickly, you have to understand the soda fountain, which was, in practical terms, the coolest place in any American town in the late 19th century. Pharmacies in this era were not the fluorescent lit antiseptic boxes of the modern world. They were social hubs, polished wood counters, gleaming brass taps, tall glass syrups and jewel colours, and a soda jerk behind the counter who could mix a carbonated concoction with the flair of a bartender and the respectability of a healthcare professional. People came to soda fountains the way people now go to coffee shops, to sit, to talk, to be seen, and to consume something stimulating in a socially acceptable context. Temperance advocates loved soda fountains because they offered an alternative to the saloon. Churches approved of them. Families brought their children. And right there on the menu, written in elegant script, available for 5 cents a glass, Coca-Cola. Brain tonic, nerve stimulant, delicious. Carbonated water itself had been considered medicinal since the late 18th century. Natural mineral springs in Europe, places like Selters in Germany, the source of what we now call seltzer, were believed to have healing properties, and the naturally occurring carbonation of their water was part of what made them special. When chemists in the early 19th century figured out how to produce carbonated water artificially by dissolving carbon dioxide under pressure, they created the foundation for an entirely new industry. Artificial mineral water, as it was initially called, could be produced anywhere, flavoured with anything, and sold to anyone who wanted the refreshing, slightly medicinal sensation of a fizzy drink without travelling to a German spa town. By the 1860s and 70s, soda fountains had become fixtures in American pharmacies. They were expensive to install, the marble counters, the brass fixtures, the carbonation machinery, and this expense paradoxically added to their social prestige. A pharmacy with a good soda fountain was a prosperous pharmacy. It attracted customers who might not otherwise need a prescription, but who wanted somewhere pleasant to sit. It was retail and social venue and mild medical establishment simultaneously. The soda jerk, named for the jerking motion used to pull the carbonated water handle, was a skilled position. A good soda jerk knew his syrups, mixed his proportions accurately, built a proper carbonated head on a drink, and could chat with customers in a way that made them want to stay longer and order more. It was functionally bartending, with all the social dimensions that implies, minus the legal complications. Temperance advocates could not object to a glass of carbonated water with flavoured syrup. It was innocent, it was refreshing, it was improving to the morals. Never mind what was in the syrup. Pemberton understood this environment perfectly because he was part of it. His sample deliveries to soda fountains were not cold calls, they were visits to colleagues, to fellow professionals who understood the value of a product that brought customers through the door reliably and repeatedly. A good fountain syrup was an asset, and Coca-Cola, with its particular combination of flavour, fizz, and whatever was making people feel quite pleasantly alert, was a very good fountain syrup. Jacob's Pharmacy proved that. And once Asa Candler took over the company and began his systematic campaign to get Coca-Cola into every soda fountain in America, the social infrastructure of the pharmacy counter became the single most effective distribution network in the history of the beverage industry. Pemberton, for all his genius, was not a businessman. He was an inventor, an addict, a tinkerer, a man who had brilliant ideas and a deeply impractical relationship with money. By 1888, 2 years after inventing Coca-Cola, he was dying of stomach cancer and desperately short of cash. He sold pieces of his formula to multiple buyers in a panic, creating a legal tangle that would take years to unravel. The man who ultimately assembled those pieces and took full control of the Coca-Cola recipe was a fellow Atlanta pharmacist named Asa Griggs Candler, who purchased all rights to the formula for somewhere between $500 and $2,300, depending on which historical account you believe. Candler was everything Pemberton was not: relentless, commercially minded, and almost maniacally focused on turning Coca-Cola from a local pharmacy drink into a national phenomenon. He also had, it must be said, absolutely no intention of removing the cocaine. Candler's acquisition of Coca-Cola is a masterpiece of opportunistic deal-making carried out against a man who was too ill and too financially desperate to negotiate effectively. Pemberton had already sold a 1/3 interest in the formula to a business partner named Frank Robinson, the man who had actually designed the Coca-Cola script logo and named the drink. He had sold another portion to 2 other investors. He had retained some share himself. By the time he was dying in the summer of 1888, the ownership of his own invention was fragmented across multiple parties, most of whom he had approached at different moments of financial crisis and sold to for whatever they would pay. Candler moved methodically. He purchased Pemberton's remaining interest first in April 1888 for $300, signed over by a man who was by then too sick to leave his house. He then tracked down and purchased the other fractional interests one by one over the following 2 years, until by 1891 he held complete ownership of the formula, the name, and the brand. The total he paid has been estimated at around $2,300. The company he created from that investment would eventually be worth hundreds of billions. Pemberton died in August 1888, a few months after selling his final stake. He died broke, in pain, still addicted to morphine, largely unaware of what he had set in motion. His funeral was a modest affair. Atlanta's newspapers gave it a few paragraphs. The man who invented one of the most valuable products in commercial history died without knowing it, which is the kind of ending that would feel contrived if a novelist wrote it, but lands in reality with the quiet, specific sadness of a true story. Candler incorporated the Coca-Cola Company in 1892, capitalized it at $50,000, and immediately set about building something that Pemberton had never thought to build: a system. Not just a product, but a system for producing it, distributing it, advertising it, and protecting it legally and commercially from all comers. He was the company's first great businessman, and in many ways its true founder. The man who turned Pemberton's backyard experiment into an empire. Asa Candler understood something that most businessmen of his era did not. The product was the advertisement. If you could get someone to try Coca-Cola once, the product would do the rest of the work. So he gave it away. Aggressively, systematically, and at enormous scale, he distributed free sample coupons for Coca-Cola to pharmacies, hotels, and soda fountains across the country. He sent calendars, clocks, and novelty items stamped with the Coca-Cola logo to every business he could reach. He hired salespeople to travel by train and by horse and by sheer persistence to every corner of the United States, pressing syrup samples into the hands of soda fountain operators and leaving behind the message, "Try it and you will sell it." By 1892, Candler had incorporated the Coca-Cola Company, trademarked the name, and was shipping syrup to every state in the Union. And the people who tried it came back, again and again and again. Candler, who was a devout Methodist and a strict teetotaler, seemed genuinely unbothered by the cocaine. Candler's marketing philosophy was rooted in a principle that modern companies spend millions of dollars rediscovering every decade. The best way to build a habit is to lower the barrier to the first experience. Every coupon he distributed was an invitation with no financial risk. Every calendar with the Coca-Cola logo was a daily reminder sitting in a kitchen or an office. Every branded clock on a pharmacy wall told customers the time and simultaneously kept the name in front of their eyes for every minute of every hour they spent in that building. This was not advertising in the modern sense of buying attention. It was infiltration, the gentle, persistent insertion of a name and a logo into the texture of daily life, until the name felt familiar, trusted, and inevitable. He was also, it must be said, ferocious about protecting the brand. He trademarked the Coca-Cola name and the distinctive script logo. He pursued imitators, and there were many, with names like Coca-Nola, Celery Cola, and the magnificently audacious Coke, with a legal aggression that sometimes outpaced the actual legal tools available to him. He understood that if people could get something that looked like Coca-Cola and was cheaper, they would, and that the value of the brand depended entirely on its exclusivity and consistency. The advertising spending was substantial for the era. Candler devoted approximately 20% of his revenues to promotion, an extraordinary proportion for the 1890s, when most businesses considered advertising a marginal expense. He placed advertisements in newspapers, on streetcar cards, on painted barn walls along rural roads, on umbrellas, on fans, on serving trays. The Coca-Cola serving tray, introduced in 1897 and featuring an attractive young woman holding a glass of Coke with the particular satisfied expression of someone who has just had an excellent pharmacological experience, became one of the most reproduced commercial images of its era. By 1900, Coca-Cola was available in every state in the Union and in some territories beyond. It was the best-selling fountain syrup in America, and it had been built not on a massive capital investment or a revolutionary distribution infrastructure, but on the simple, stubborn application of one idea. If you can get someone to try it once, they will come back. The cocaine helped. The caffeine helped. But Candler's relentless promotional machinery helped just as much, and it was building something that cocaine could never have sustained on its own. A brand, a feeling. An association between this particular brown fizzy drink and a specific kind of refreshed, contented, ordinary American pleasure that would outlast the cocaine by more than a century. For the first 15 or so years of Coca-Cola's existence, the presence of coca leaf extract in the formula was not a scandal. It was a selling point. Advertisements from the 1880s and 90s openly described it as a coca beverage. The word was right there in the name. Nobody was hiding anything, largely because nobody thought there was anything to hide. Cocaine was legal, available over the counter, and recommended by actual doctors for everything from toothaches to depression. But as the new century approached, things began to shift. Newspapers started running stories about cocaine's darker side. Addiction reports piled up, and a specific, ugly, racially charged panic began spreading through southern states. A manufactured fear that cocaine use among black Americans was fueling crime, a narrative that was both wildly false and devastatingly effective at turning public opinion. Suddenly, the coca in Coca-Cola was not a charming heritage ingredient, it was a liability. The shift in cocaine's public image happened quickly, and was driven by forces that had less to do with science than with politics and prejudice. Throughout the 1890s, cocaine had maintained its respectable, even glamorous reputation. It was in tooth drops. It was in hay fever remedies. It was in the soda at the pharmacy. But the same decade also saw a sharp increase in cocaine use outside of medical contexts, particularly in urban areas, and the media coverage of this shift was framed in language that was deliberately and viciously racialized. Southern newspapers ran stories, largely fabricated or grotesquely exaggerated, claiming that cocaine was making black men violent and giving them superhuman strength that made them impervious to bullets. Journalists and politicians amplified these claims with the specific goal of passing legislation that would restrict cocaine access, and they packaged their racist panic in the language of public safety. The effect was rapid and brutal. Cocaine, which had been a respectable middle-class tonic ingredient in 1895, was a symbol of social threat and moral decay by 1905. And Coca-Cola, whose name contained the word right there in plain sight, found itself uncomfortably associated with a substance that was rapidly acquiring a very different kind of notoriety. Asa Kander's response was to begin quietly distancing the company from the coca connection in its advertising. The word cocaine had never appeared in Coca-Cola's promotional materials. The company had always used the more romantic coca language, but now even that began to fade. The advertising shifted toward refreshment, toward pleasure, toward the experience of drinking the product rather than the pharmacological properties that produced that experience. You were not being told what was in Coca-Cola. You were being shown how good it felt to drink it. And the company, watching the political winds with the acute attention of an organization that had a great deal to protect, began working on the question that would define its chemistry for the next 2 decades. Was there a way to keep the coca leaf flavor without keeping the cocaine? The answer, it would turn out, was yes. But the road to that answer involved government agents, seized barrels, a lawsuit with one of the most extraordinary titles in legal history, and a level of corporate anxiety that suggests the people inside the Coca-Cola company in 1905 were not sleeping particularly well. If you wanted to pick one man most personally responsible for the legal pressure that eventually forced Coca-Cola to change its formula, you would want Harvey Washington Wiley, a chemist, a bureaucrat, a relentless moralist, and a man who was absolutely furious about what Americans were putting in their bodies. As head of the Bureau of Chemistry in the United States Department of Agriculture, Wiley spent the 1890s and early 1900s waging a one-man campaign against the patent medicine industry, adulterated food, and pretty much every product being sold to the American public without honest labelling. He lobbied for what would become the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, a genuinely landmark piece of legislation that required products to list their ingredients and banned certain adulterants. And then he pointed his considerable attention directly at Coca-Cola. Wiley was not a subtle man. He was the kind of bureaucrat who believed, with the ferocity of a person who has never once doubted himself, that the public was being systematically poisoned by an indifferent food industry, and that he, personally, was the only person standing between the American people and a slow death by adulterated condiments. He was not entirely wrong about the food industry. The America of the 1890s was awash in products that contained things their labels did not mention: preservatives, dyes, fillers, and active pharmaceutical ingredients that range from mildly problematic to genuinely dangerous. Wiley had spent years documenting this, publishing findings, and being largely ignored by an industry with excellent lobbyists and considerable political connections. His most famous tactic was the Poison Squad, a group of young male volunteers at the Department of Agriculture who agreed to eat meals deliberately dosed with various food preservatives so that Wiley could document the effects. They ate borax in their butter, formaldehyde in their milk, and salicylic acid in their meat, and Wiley recorded everything that happened to them with the meticulous attention of a man who was also, it must be said, generating enormous amounts of newspaper coverage. The Poison Squad was a sensation. It made Wiley famous. It made food adulteration a public issue in a way that dry government reports never had, and it laid the political groundwork for the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, which passed in the same week as Upton Sinclair's The Jungle was making Americans deeply suspicious of everything they were eating. When Wiley turned his attention to Coca-Cola, he had a specific target in mind: caffeine. The cocaine, by the time Wiley got seriously involved around 1907 and 1908, had already been substantially reduced in the formula. The company had been quietly managing that transition for several years. But caffeine remained, in significant quantities, and Wiley believed it was an adulterant, a substance added to a product that was not part of its natural composition, and that had pharmacological effects the consumer was not informed about. He also had a personal and somewhat idiosyncratic conviction that caffeine was particularly dangerous for children and young people, and the sight of children drinking Coca-Cola at soda fountains genuinely offended him. The Coca-Cola Company, which had successfully navigated around the Pure Food and Drug Act by arguing that its syrup was sold to bottlers and fountain operators rather than directly to consumers, found itself increasingly in Wiley's crosshairs. He pushed for a government seizure. He pushed for a prosecution. And in 1909 he got it, though the case that followed would prove considerably more complicated than he had anticipated, and its outcome would be far more ambiguous than either side wanted. Wiley had started a fight with an organisation that had more money, better lawyers, and a considerably larger public relations operation than anything the Bureau of Chemistry could deploy. It was not going to be clean. In October of 1909, agents from the United States government boarded a train in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and seized 40 barrels and 20 kegs of Coca-Cola syrup. The official charge: the product contained an ingredient, caffeine, that the government considered an adulterant under the Pure Food and Drug Act, meaning it was present in a product that did not disclose it properly on the label. The case was called United States versus 40 barrels and 20 kegs of Coca-Cola, which is one of the greatest legal case titles in American history, and sounds less like a federal prosecution and more like a very specific Western. The trial that followed was a circus of chemistry, corporate defensiveness, competing experts, and government overreach, and the outcome would shape how Coca-Cola handled its formula for the next century. The cocaine, quietly, had already been dealt with by then, but the caffeine, that was a different fight entirely. The trial began in March of 1911 in Chattanooga, and it was, by any standard, a spectacle. The government brought in chemists to testify about the effects of caffeine on the human nervous system. The Coca-Cola company brought in its own chemist to contradict them. Wiley himself was not permitted to testify. He had been outmaneuvered politically within the Department of Agriculture by this point, his authority quietly clipped by superiors who had grown tired of his crusades, but his influence hung over the proceedings regardless. The government's central argument was that caffeine was an adulterant, a foreign substance added to Coca-Cola that was not naturally part of its composition. This was, the defense pointed out, a strange position to take about a product called Coca-Cola, given that the cola nut, from which the cola portion of the name derived, naturally contained caffeine. If caffeine was naturally present in one of the drink's two named ingredients, it was difficult to argue it was a foreign adulterant. The government's lawyers attempted to navigate this by arguing that the amount of caffeine in modern Coca-Cola exceeded what would naturally occur from the cola extract alone, suggesting that additional caffeine had been added, which it turned out was true. The company had been supplementing its naturally occurring caffeine with additional caffeine since around 1903. This was not a detail they were eager to highlight. The trial produced one of the more remarkable expert witness spectacles in early 20th century American legal history. Dozens of scientists, physicians, and pharmacologists were called to testify about what caffeine did to the human body, and their testimonies range from the cautious to the catastrophic. One expert testified that caffeine caused moral deterioration in young people. Another argued it was no more dangerous than a cup of tea. A third spent several days on the stand discussing the neurological effects of methylxanthines with a level of technical detail that reportedly caused at least 2 jurors to fall asleep, which, given the subject matter, had a certain poetic quality. The judge ultimately ruled in Coca-Cola's favour on a technicality, deciding that the government had not properly established that caffeine was an adulterant under the precise legal definition of the Pure Food and Drug Act. The government appealed. The case wound through the courts for years, reaching the Supreme Court in 1916, which sent it back for retrial. By the time it was finally settled in 1917, Coca-Cola had agreed to reduce its caffeine content slightly, and the government had agreed to go away. Nobody was entirely happy. Everybody claimed victory. The 40 barrels, presumably, had long since been returned and consumed. Here is the part the company's official history tends to describe with a great deal of careful language. Coca-Cola did not remove cocaine because it was dangerous. It removed cocaine because the social and political climate made it a business risk. The precise timeline is a matter of some debate among historians, but the general picture is this. By the early 1900s, the amount of active cocaine in a serving of Coca-Cola had already been substantially reduced, as the company began using decoconized coca leaf extract, leaves that had been processed to remove most of the cocaine alkaloid while retaining the flavour compounds. By around 1903, according to most historians, the cocaine content had been reduced to trace levels, and by the 1920s, the process was essentially complete. The coca leaf extract remained, processed by a single licensed company, and that company still processes coca leaves for Coca-Cola today. But the cocaine itself, gone, quietly, without a press release. The process of decocainization, removing the cocaine alkaloid from coca leaves while preserving the flavour compounds, was not a simple one. Coca leaves contain dozens of chemical compounds beyond cocaine, including aromatic oils and flavour molecules that contribute to the distinctive taste that Pemberton had originally built into his formula. Simply eliminating the coca extract entirely would have changed the flavour in ways that consumers would have noticed. And in a product whose commercial value rested entirely on its consistency, on the guarantee that every glass tasted exactly like every other glass, changing the flavour was not an option. The solution came through a relationship with the Maywood Chemical Works of New Jersey, which had been processing coca leaves since the 1890s and had developed the technical capability to extract and remove the cocaine alkaloid while leaving the remaining flavour compounds largely intact. The Coca-Cola company became Maywood's primary client for decoconized coca extract, and the arrangement was formalised in a way that persists under a different corporate name to this day. What is striking about the timing is how clearly it tracks with the political and social climate rather than with any scientific revelation. The first reductions in cocaine content came in the early 1900s, precisely when the racial panic about cocaine was reaching its peak in southern newspapers and state legislatures. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914, which placed strict federal controls on cocaine and opium products, made complete decocainization not just prudent, but legally necessary for any product sold to the general public. The company, characteristically, had been moving in that direction for years before the law required it. The official corporate history frames the removal as a proactive, responsible decision. The actual history suggests it was a reactive one, a company watching the legal and cultural landscape carefully and adjusting its formula at precisely the pace required to stay ahead of regulation while minimizing disruption to its product. This is not necessarily a criticism. It is, in fact, a fairly accurate description of how most large food and beverage companies navigate regulatory change. But it is worth noting, simply for the sake of honest accounting, that nobody at the Coca-Cola company in 1902 convened a meeting and said the cocaine needs to come out because it is harming our customers. What they said, in effect, was the cocaine needs to come out because keeping it in is becoming bad for business. The result was the same. The reasoning was different, and the distinction tells you something about how large commercial enterprises make decisions that history later describes as progress. Right now, in the United States of America, there's exactly one company legally authorized to import coca leaves and process them for commercial use. Its name is the Stepan Company, a chemical manufacturer based in Maywood, New Jersey, and it has held this exclusive arrangement with the Coca-Cola company for over a century. Every year, Stepan imports approximately 100 metric tons of coca leaves, primarily from Peru, under a Drug Enforcement Administration license that is essentially unique in all of American law. They extract the cocaine alkaloid, which is then sold to pharmaceutical companies for use as a topical anesthetic in certain medical procedures, and what remains, the decocainized flavor extract, goes to Coca-Cola. The arrangement is entirely legal, openly documented and almost never discussed. It is also one of the more extraordinary footnotes in the history of American commerce. The world's most famous soft drink is still, to this day, made with coca leaves. The Stepan Company does not advertise this. It is not the kind of thing that appears in their marketing materials or their annual report highlights. They are a specialty chemical manufacturer with a wide range of products and business lines, and the coca leaf processing is, from their perspective, simply one contract among many. From a historical perspective, however, it is one of the most remarkable ongoing commercial arrangements in American industrial history. A direct, unbroken line stretching from John Pemberton's brass kettle in 1886 to a chemical plant in New Jersey, operating under a federal narcotics license in the present day. The DEA license that permits Stepan to import and process coca leaves is classified as a Schedule II Controlled Substance Handling Authorization, the same category that covers pharmaceutical opioids and medical-grade cocaine. Stepan is the only non-pharmaceutical entity in the United States that holds such a license for coca leaves. The license is renewed periodically, and is subject to inspection and oversight, which means that somewhere in a federal building in Washington, there are officials whose job description includes monitoring the annual coca leaf import levels of the Coca-Cola company. This is a sentence that sounds like it belongs in a conspiracy novel, but is simply bureaucratic reality. The cocaine extracted in this process, approximately 1 metric ton per year, by most estimates, does not go to waste. It is sold in pharmaceutical-grade purified form to Mallinckrodt Inc., a specialty pharmaceutical manufacturer, which produces cocaine hydrochloride solution for medical use. Cocaine hydrochloride is still a legally used local anesthetic in certain ear, nose, and throat procedures. It has the unique property of both numbing tissue and constricting blood vessels simultaneously, which makes it useful in surgeries where bleeding control and anesthesia are both needed. It is the only drug on the DEA's controlled substance schedule that is simultaneously a Schedule II pharmaceutical and a key flavour ingredient in a globally distributed soft drink, which is a distinction so specific that it barely seems worth having a category for. The Peruvian coca farmers who grow the leaves that eventually end up in both your Coca-Cola and a surgeon's instrument tray are operating legally within Peru's regulated coca cultivation program, which permits cultivation for traditional and industrial uses while attempting to restrict cultivation for cocaine production. The relationship between Stepan, the Coca-Cola company, and the Peruvian coca industry is a supply chain that spans continents, involves multiple layers of international regulation, and produces, at its end, a brown carbonated beverage that billions of people drink without thinking about any of this, which is, presumably, exactly how everyone involved prefers it. Coca gets all the attention, but it only provides half the name. The cola in Coca-Cola comes from the cola nut, a seed from a tree native to the tropical rainforests of West Africa, which had been used for centuries across the continent as a stimulant, a social offering, and a ceremonial gift. Cola nuts contain caffeine and theobromine, the same compound found in chocolate, and when chewed, produce a gentle, sustained energy lift. They also turn the saliva red, which is either alarming or festive depending on your perspective. West African traders and labourers had long used cola nuts to reduce hunger and fatigue during long journeys. When they were brought to the Americas through the slave trade, the nut travelled with them. By the time Pemberton was formulating his drink in the 1880s, cola nut extract was well known in American patent medicine circles as an ingredient that gave a product genuine staying power. Combined with the coca leaf extract, it produced something that was, by the standards of the era, genuinely medicinal in effect and genuinely addictive. The cola nut's role in West African culture extended well beyond its pharmacological properties. In many societies across the region, cola nuts were offered as a sign of hospitality and respect, presented to guests, exchanged between families during negotiations, offered at weddings and funerals. In some communities, the sharing of cola was a sacred act, a form of communion between people and between the living and the ancestors. The nut had cultural weight that went far beyond its stimulant properties, and that weight reflects something important. Cultures that had been using cola for centuries understood that it affected the body and mind, and they had developed ritual frameworks for that use that provided context, meaning, and social regulation. The contrast with how cola nut extract was used in American patent medicines is, if you look at it directly, somewhat uncomfortable. An ingredient with deep cultural significance and carefully maintained social context in its place of origin was extracted, exported, stripped of that context, and mixed into a commercial tonic product, where it served primarily as a vehicle for selling more units. This was not unusual for the era. European and American manufacturers of the late 19th century routinely appropriated ingredients from colonized cultures without acknowledgement or compensation. But it is worth noting, if only because Coca-Cola's origin story is usually told with Atlanta as its beginning, when in fact it has roots that stretch considerably further and in directions that receive far less attention. The caffeine content of cola nut extract made it genuinely functional as a stimulant ingredient. A serving of Coca-Cola in the early 1900s, before the caffeine reduction that followed the government lawsuit, contained approximately 80 milligrams of caffeine, roughly equivalent to a modern cup of coffee. Combined with the coca leaf extract's cocaine content, this produced a stimulant effect that was both immediate and sustained, with the cocaine providing the sharp initial lift and the caffeine extending the energy and alertness into a longer plateau. It was, from a purely pharmacological perspective, an extremely well-designed stimulant beverage. It just was not designed to be a stimulant beverage. It was designed to be a medicine, which in the 1880s was a distinction with very little practical meaning. Modern Coca-Cola contains approximately 34 milligrams of caffeine per 12-ounce serving, less than the early formula, less than a cup of coffee, and considerably less than most energy drinks. The cola nut extract that originally provided this caffeine has, in most formulations, been replaced by synthetic caffeine, or caffeine derived from tea and coffee byproducts. The name remains. The nut largely does not, which means that of the two ingredients that gave Coca-Cola its name, one has been decocainized beyond recognition, and the other has been mostly replaced by a synthetic substitute. The name Coca-Cola is, in this sense, more historical monument than ingredient description, a tribute to a formula that no longer quite exists, carrying the ghost of a chemistry that the 20th century quietly decided it would rather not acknowledge. The Coca-Cola formula is one of the most successfully guarded trade secrets in corporate history. The company claims it is known to only 2 executives at any given time, that those executives are never permitted to travel on the same plane, and that the written formula is kept in a vault at the World of Coca-Cola Museum in Atlanta. Whether all of this is true, partially true, or an enormously effective piece of marketing is genuinely difficult to say. The flavour components beyond the coca and cola extracts are referred to internally as Merchandise 7X, a name so mysteriously specific that it has generated a century's worth of speculation, reverse engineering attempts, and at least one published leaked recipe in a newspaper that the company immediately denied. The reality is that the formula is almost certainly protectable, not because the ingredients are so exotic, but because the precise ratios and processing methods are extraordinarily difficult to replicate. Many have tried. None have succeeded in producing something that tastes identical. Something in those proportions is, apparently, irreplaceable. The decision to protect the Coca-Cola formula as a trade secret rather than a patent was made by Asa Candler, and it was a decision of genuine commercial genius. A patent provides legal protection but requires public disclosure. You must describe your invention in sufficient detail that someone else could reproduce it, and the protection expires after a fixed period. A trade secret provides no legal protection from independent discovery or reverse engineering, but it never expires. As long as the secret is kept, it is kept forever. Candler calculated correctly that the formula could be kept secret indefinitely if the company controlled its own production tightly enough, and he was right. 139 years later, the formula remains officially undisclosed. The mythology around the secrecy has been carefully cultivated. Stories of the 2 executive rule, the no shared airplane policy, and the Atlanta Vault are repeated in every profile of the company, every documentary about the brand, and every tour of the World of Coca-Cola Museum, where visitors can stand before the vault and contemplate what might be inside. The theatrical staging of the secret is itself part of the product. A formula that is merely proprietary is a business detail. A formula that is guarded like a national treasure, known to only two people, locked in a vault, that is a story. And stories, as the Coca-Cola company has understood since Asa Candler's first advertising calendars, sell beverages. The leaked formula story is worth examining because it illustrates how robustly the company defends the mythology. In February of 2012, the public radio program This American Life broadcast a segment in which journalist Ira Glass described finding what appeared to be an original handwritten version of the Coca-Cola formula in a 1979 photograph of a newspaper column from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. The newspaper had published it as a curiosity, a recipe supposedly written by Pemberton himself. A researcher had transcribed and tested it. The Coca-Cola company responded swiftly and definitively. This was not the formula. The real formula was in the vault. It had not been leaked. It would not be leaked. The response was so rapid and so emphatic that it served, paradoxically, to reinforce the mystique rather than dispel it. Of course, they would say it was not the formula. That is exactly what they would say. What Merchandise 7X almost certainly contains, based on decades of food science analysis and the best available reverse engineering, is a blend of essential oils, orange, lemon, lime, cassia, coriander, and nutmeg being the most commonly cited candidates, combined in specific proportions that produce the particular aromatic profile of Coca-Cola. The proportions are everything. The ingredients, individually, are not unusual. The recipe as a whole is something nobody has quite managed to duplicate, which is either proof that the formula is genuinely extraordinary or proof that familiarity is its own form of flavour, that Coca-Cola tastes like Coca-Cola partly because it is Coca-Cola, and no imitation, however chemically accurate, will ever quite taste the same. For the first 2 decades of Coca-Cola's existence, it was sold exclusively as a fountain drink, syrup mixed with carbonated water at the point of sale. Bottling it was for complicated technical reasons involving carbonation and seal integrity, not yet practical for mass distribution. That changed in the 1890s when 2 lawyers from Chattanooga, Benjamin Thomas and Joseph Whitehead, convinced Asa Candler to grant them bottling rights for $1. Candler, who thought bottled soda would never amount to much, agreed. It amounted to quite a lot. And by 1915 the company was deeply concerned about the proliferation of imitation products in irregular bottles, so they held a design competition for a new bottle, one that would be recognizable even in the dark, even broken, even when seen only in silhouette. The Root Glass Company of Terre Haute, Indiana, won the competition with a design inspired, reportedly, by a cocoa pod, the curved, ribbed shape that remains, over 100 years later, one of the most instantly recognizable objects on the planet. The bottling rights deal that Candler struck in 1899 for $1 is one of the most consequential and one-sided commercial agreements in American business history. Thomas and Whitehead were lawyers, not chemists, and they had no particular expertise in beverage manufacturing. What they had was an idea, and the tenacity to get in front of Candler and make it sound reasonable. They proposed to bottle Coca-Cola using their own equipment, their own facilities, and their own distribution networks, paying the company for its syrup at a fixed rate. Candler would retain complete control of the formula and the syrup. They would handle everything else. The $1 payment was not a purchase price. It was a token consideration to make the contract legally binding, the commercial equivalent of a handshake in a document. Candler thought he was granting something trivial. He was granting the future of the company. Within a decade, the bottling network that Thomas and Whitehead established had expanded to hundreds of independent bottlers across the country, each operating under a sub-franchise agreement that maintained the Coca-Cola brand standards while allowing local ownership and distribution. This structure, The company controlling the syrup, independent bottlers controlling everything downstream, turned out to be one of the most efficient commercial expansion mechanisms ever devised. The company grew without having to build factories. The bottlers assumed the capital risk. The syrup revenue flowed upward to Atlanta regardless of whether any individual bottler succeeded or failed. The bottle itself became a crisis only when the market grew crowded. By 1915, there were hundreds of imitator colas on the market, and many of them were being sold in bottles that resembled the standard straight-sided soda bottle used by everyone, including Coca-Cola. A customer reaching for a Coke in a dark icebox could easily grab something else entirely. The competition brief that went out to glass manufacturers for a new, distinctive Coca-Cola bottle specified exactly this requirement. The bottle had to be recognizable in the dark by touch alone, even if broken. The Root Glass Company's winning design was developed by a team that included a glassworker named Alexander Samuelson, who reportedly looked up the word coca in an encyclopedia, found a picture of a cocoa pod, which is botanically unrelated to coca but visually distinctive, and built the contoured shape from that reference. The resulting bottle, with its narrow waist, flared base, and distinctive ribbed texture, was approved in 1915 and went into production immediately. It won a design award from the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1969, which completed its journey from commercial packaging to certified cultural artifact, one of those rare objects whose function and form have become so perfectly merged that it is impossible to imagine the world without it. If there is one moment in which Coca-Cola transformed from an American product into a global one, it is probably the Second World War. When the United States entered the conflict in 1941, the president of Coca-Cola, Robert Woodruff, made an extraordinary announcement. Every American soldier anywhere in the world would have access to a bottle of Coca-Cola for 5 cents, regardless of what it cost the company to get it there. The military, charmed by the morale implications, cooperated. 64 portable bottling plants were shipped to military theatres across the globe, from North Africa to the Pacific Islands. Over 5 billion bottles were consumed by American troops during the war, and wherever American soldiers drank Coca-Cola, they left behind a craving. European civilians who had never tasted it wanted it. The demand that the war created became the foundation of Coca-Cola's post-war international expansion. The company hadn't just sold a beverage. It had wrapped itself around the mythology of American power, freedom, and victory. The First World War had given Coca-Cola its first taste of wartime opportunity. When the United States entered the conflict in 1917, the company positioned Coca-Cola as a patriotic product, a beverage that sustained the industrial workers building the war machine, that refreshed the soldiers in training camps, that represented the wholesome, energetic American spirit. Sugar rationing created complications, and the company lobbied successfully for preferential sugar allocations on the grounds that Coca-Cola was essential to national morale. Whether or not the government agreed with that framing, the company got its sugar. It emerged from the First World War with its domestic market intact and its reputation for patriotic alignment established. The Second World War was an entirely different scale of operation. Woodruff's pledge, 5 cents for every soldier, everywhere, no matter the cost, was not a small commercial decision. Getting Coca-Cola to soldiers in North Africa, in the Pacific Theatre, in the mountains of Italy, and on the beaches of Normandy required an extraordinary logistical undertaking. The military designated Coca-Cola technical observers, civilian contractors who travelled with the armed forces to set up and operate the portable bottling units. These men, known informally as Coke colonels, were given military ranks, military accommodations, and the full logistical support of the United States Army in exchange for keeping the soda flowing. At its peak, Coca-Cola was operating bottling facilities in theatres of war across 6 continents. The cost to the company was enormous. The return on investment was incalculable. When the war ended and American troops came home, Coca-Cola was already established in the infrastructure of dozens of countries that had hosted American military operations. Local bottlers had been identified, distribution networks had been established, and the local populations who had been watching Americans drink Coca-Cola for 3 or 4 years had developed a powerful association between the product and everything the American victory seemed to represent: energy, optimism, abundance, and the particular pleasure of a cold carbonated drink in the middle of a difficult day. The post-war international expansion of Coca-Cola was not built from scratch. It was built on the foundation that the military campaign had inadvertently laid. The 64 portable bottling plants that had followed American troops around the world had done more for Coca-Cola's global presence than any advertising campaign could have managed. War, it turned out, was the best distribution network the company ever had. By the 1970s, Coca-Cola was the dominant soft drink in the world, and had been for decades. Then Pepsi did something audacious. It ran a blind taste test. In shopping malls and public squares across America, strangers were handed 2 unlabeled cups of cola and asked which they preferred. And a disturbing number of them chose Pepsi. The campaign was called the Pepsi Challenge, and it worked. Not because Pepsi was objectively better, but because Pepsi, being slightly sweeter, tends to win in a single sip. Coca-Cola's profile is more complex and is designed for sustained drinking, not for a dramatic first impression. But try explaining that to corporate panic. The Pepsi Challenge sent Coca-Cola into a years-long identity crisis, market research spiral, and ultimately the most catastrophic product decision in beverage history, which we will get to shortly, and which involves changing the formula, executives crying, and the American public losing its collective mind. Pepsi-Cola had existed almost as long as Coca-Cola. It was formulated in 1893 by a pharmacist named Caleb Bradham in North Carolina, who called it Brad's Drink, before renaming it Pepsi-Cola in 1898. For much of the early 20th century, it was a distant second to Coca-Cola, and it had nearly gone bankrupt twice. Once after the First World War, when sugar prices collapsed and the company had locked in at peak prices, and once during the Great Depression. Its survival through these crises was a testament to the durability of the cola market, if not to Pepsi's own strategic brilliance. The Pepsi Challenge campaign launched in 1975, and its genius was in its simplicity. You handed someone 2 cups. You did not tell them which was which. You asked which they preferred. And in those tests, in enough locations and with enough participants to constitute a statistically significant result, more people preferred Pepsi. Pepsi turned this into one of the most effective advertising campaigns in the history of consumer goods. Television commercials showing real people, in real locations, choosing Pepsi over Coke in blind tests, their expressions registering genuine surprise at their own preference. The explanation for why people chose Pepsi in a single sip, but often preferred Coke for sustained drinking, lies in the chemistry of sweetness. Pepsi contains more sugar per serving than Coke, and has a sweeter flavour profile that registers as more immediately pleasurable in a small quantity. In a taste test where you're drinking perhaps half an ounce of each cola from a small cup, sweetness wins. In a 12-ounce bottle consumed over the course of 20 minutes, the dynamic is different. Coke's more complex, slightly more acidic, less overtly sweet profile holds up better over a longer drinking experience. The Pepsi Challenge was, in this sense, testing for something real, but measuring it in a way that was inherently favourable to Pepsi's strengths. Coca-Cola's marketing team understood this, which made it no less infuriating when the commercials ran. Coca-Cola's response was initially dismissive. then increasingly anxious as Pepsi's market share continued to climb through the late 1970s and early 1980s. By 1983, Pepsi had pulled ahead of Coca-Cola in supermarket sales, not overall, where Coke still led because of its vastly larger fountain and vending machine presence, but in the category that was most visible to consumers and most covered by trade publications. The anxiety inside the Atlanta headquarters was real, sustained, and ultimately led to a decision so catastrophically misguided that it remains, 40 years later, the standard reference point for what happens when a corporation confuses market research with understanding what its customers actually value. On April the 23rd, 1985, the Coca-Cola Company announced that it was changing the formula of Coca-Cola, the original beloved century-old formula, and replacing it with a new, sweeter version they called New Coke. The reaction was so fast, so furious, and so genuinely unhinged that it has since been studied in business schools as a masterclass in misunderstanding consumer psychology. Within 24 hours, the company received 1,500 calls to its customer hotline. Within weeks, that number had climbed into the tens of thousands. Not calls of curiosity, but calls of rage. People wept. People held protests. A retired bottler in Seattle formed a group called Old Cola Drinkers of America. Cases of old Formula Coke were hoarded like emergency rations. A man in San Antonio reportedly called to say that changing Coca-Cola was a worse decision than Watergate, which is a comparison that raises a number of questions about his sense of proportion, but nonetheless captures the emotional temperature of the moment. The decision to change the formula had followed years of market research that was, by any technical standard, thorough and extensive. The company had conducted nearly 200,000 taste tests comparing the new formula to the old one and to Pepsi. In those tests, the new formula consistently outperformed both. People preferred it. The data was unambiguous. The scientists and marketers who had run the tests presented the findings with confidence. The executives who approved the change believed they were making a rational, evidence-based decision to improve their product in response to a genuine competitive threat. What they had failed to test was the one variable that mattered most: how people would feel about the change itself. Taste tests measure preference between options in isolation. They do not measure the emotional relationship between a consumer and a product. They have been drinking their entire lives. That their parents drank, that their grandparents drank, that was present at every birthday party and summer barbecue and ordinary Wednesday afternoon of their existence. Coca-Cola was not just a flavour, it was a memory. It was a continuity. It was, for a significant portion of the American public, something that felt closer to cultural heritage than to a consumer product. And you cannot change cultural heritage without consequences, no matter how good your taste test data is. The company was caught completely off guard by the intensity of the response. The hotline, established as a goodwill gesture to handle consumer questions, was overwhelmed within days. Employees answering calls reported that people were not just expressing displeasure, they were grieving. They were angry in the way people get angry when something they love is taken from them without their consent. One woman called to say that the people who made this decision should be ashamed of themselves. A man called from a payphone to say he was buying every bottle of old Coke he could find. The company received angry letters, some running to several pages, some written in terms more appropriate to a political manifesto than a complaint about a soda. The scale and sincerity of the reaction was by any measure extraordinary, and it told the company something about its own product that no amount of taste testing had been able to reveal. Coca-Cola was not the best cola. It was their cola. And nobody had asked their permission to change it. 79 days after introducing New Coke, the Coca-Cola Company announced it was bringing back the original formula under the name Coca-Cola Classic. The press conference was covered by every major news network. The executive making the announcement had to pause several times because the crowd kept cheering. Senator David Pryor of Arkansas took to the floor of the United States Senate to call it a meaningful moment in American history, which again raises questions about his sense of proportion, but also tells you something about how deeply embedded Coca-Cola had become in the national psyche. The conventional interpretation was that Coca-Cola had made a mistake and corrected it. The more cynical interpretation, whispered for years and never definitively disproved, was that the whole thing was engineered, that the company deliberately introduced a worse product, provoked an emotional backlash, and then restored the original to create a surge of grateful customer loyalty that no advertisement could have produced. The company has denied this. The company also increased sales dramatically in the months following the restoration. The press conference on July 10th, 1985 was, by the standards of corporate communications, an extraordinary piece of theatre. Donald Keogh, the company's president, stood before a room full of journalists and said something that no senior executive of a major corporation ever says. We made a mistake, not a strategic adjustment, not a market realignment, a mistake. He said the company had underestimated the deep and abiding emotional attachment that Americans had to the original Coca-Cola formula. He said it with what appeared to be genuine contrition and what was certainly genuine relief. The room responded with warmth. The news coverage was overwhelmingly positive. A company that had spent 2 months being mocked and vilified was suddenly being celebrated for its humility and its responsiveness to its customers. The narrative had flipped completely. Sales of Coca-Cola Classic in the weeks following the restoration exceeded any previous sales figures for the product. People who had not bought Coca-Cola in years went to the store specifically to welcome it back. People who had been hoarding cases of old formula reported a surge of patriotic satisfaction at cracking one open in celebration. The emotional response to the restoration was, if anything, more intense than the emotional response to the removal, because the removal had been grief and anger, which are painful, and the restoration was relief and vindication, which feel wonderful. The company had managed, whether by accident or design, to create one of the most effective consumer loyalty events in the history of marketing. The conspiracy theory that the whole new Coke episode was deliberate has circulated in business circles ever since. Its most compelling evidence is not the sales surge after the restoration, which could easily be explained by pent-up demand, but the timing of the announcement. The restoration came exactly 79 days after the introduction of New Coke, which is a suspiciously precise interval for a decision described as a spontaneous response to consumer feedback. Consumer research takes time. Focus groups take time. Corporate decision-making at that level takes time. For the company to have genuinely gathered, analysed and acted on consumer feedback in 79 days would have required a speed of organisational response that is, to put it charitably, inconsistent with the pace at which large corporations typically operate. Keogh himself addressed the conspiracy theory directly and memorably. He said that Coca-Cola was not that smart and not that dumb, not smart enough to have engineered such a complex psychological operation, and not dumb enough to have accidentally stumbled into the most effective loyalty campaign in beverage history. It was, he said, simply a mistake that they were grateful to have been given the opportunity to correct. Whether you believe him depends, perhaps, on how much credit you're willing to give to a company that has been exceptionally good at marketing for over 100 years. Let's take a calm, honest inventory of what is in a modern can of Coca-Cola, because the ingredients list is considerably less dramatic than its history. Carbonated water, high fructose corn syrup or sugar, depending on the country and the product. Caramel colour, which is produced by heating sugar and is responsible for that distinctive brown hue. Phosphoric acid, which gives it that slightly sharp, tangy bite, and also gently dissolves tooth enamel, which is a detail the company does not emphasize in its marketing. Natural flavors, which is the category where the mysterious merchandise 7X lives, a blend of essential oils including orange, lemon, lime, cinnamon, and others in specific proportions. Caffeine, present at approximately 34 milligrams per 12-ounce serving, which is less than a cup of coffee but more than zero, which is why that government case over 40 barrels was so contentious. And the decoconized coca leaf extract, still there, still flavouring, still technically coca. The carbonated water is doing more work than most people realise. Carbonation is not merely a textural choice, it is a functional one that affects how the flavour compounds are delivered to the palate. The carbon dioxide dissolved in the water creates carbonic acid, which contributes a mild sharpness to the overall flavour profile, and interacts with the phosphoric acid to produce the distinctive bite that distinguishes cola from a flat sweetened beverage. It also affects how the aromatic compounds in the essential oil blend reach the nose. Carbonation releases volatile aromatic molecules more efficiently than still water, which is why a flat Coca-Cola smells and tastes noticeably different from a properly carbonated one, even though the non-carbonation related ingredients are identical. The caramel colour is classified as caramel colour class 4, the darkest variety, produced by heating sugar with ammonium compounds. It has been the subject of occasional health concern because the heating process produces trace amounts of a compound called 4-methylimidazole, or 4-MEI, which showed carcinogenic effects in high-dose animal studies. The state of California added it to its list of chemicals requiring warning labels under Proposition 65. Coca-Cola, rather than add a warning label to its California products, reduced the 4-MEI content of its caramel colour by working with its suppliers to modify the manufacturing process, a response that was simultaneously pragmatic and a tacit acknowledgement that the concern was not entirely without merit. The phosphoric acid is the ingredient that produces the most alarming demonstrations when you look them up online. Videos of teeth dissolving in Coca-Cola, pennies being cleaned with the stuff, and various metal objects being stripped of rust by prolonged immersion in cola have been circulating on the internet for decades and are, to be fair, not entirely misleading. Phosphoric acid is genuinely corrosive to dental enamel over time and with frequent exposure. The relevant qualifier is over time, drinking a can of Coke is not the same as bathing your teeth in acid for hours, and the salivary response to any acidic food or beverage provides some protective buffering. But the concern is not imaginary, and dentists have been noting the correlation between heavy cola consumption and enamel erosion for long enough that it constitutes a genuine clinical observation rather than a health panic. And then, at the bottom of the ingredients list, almost parenthetical in its brevity, natural flavours. This is where everything interesting lives. Natural flavours is the regulatory category that covers the essential oil blend, the coca extract, and whatever other aromatic compounds the company includes in merchandise 7X. It is a legally permissible label that conceals almost everything that makes Coca-Cola taste like Coca-Cola. It is, in its modest, unhelpful way, the most consequential 2 words on the can. If you have ever drunk a Coca-Cola in Mexico and thought it tasted somehow better, you are not imagining things. Mexican Coke is made with cane sugar, rather than high fructose corn syrup, which produces a slightly different flavour profile, rounder, less sharp, that many people find preferable to the American version. This is why you will find Mexican Coke in a glass bottle at every hipster burger restaurant in the continental United States, sold at a $3 premium over the domestic product. The global variation in Coca-Cola's formula is not just about sweeteners, it reflects differences in local sugar markets, government regulations, consumer taste preferences, and decades of regional bottling decisions. In some countries, the drink is slightly less sweet. In others, the carbonation level differs. The company tightly controls the core formula, but the final product is not as uniform across borders as the brand's global consistency would suggest. Coca-Cola is, in this way, simultaneously the most standardized and the most locally adapted product on Earth. The shift from cane sugar to high fructose corn syrup in American Coca-Cola happened in the early 1980s, driven by economics rather than flavor preference. High fructose corn syrup became significantly cheaper than cane sugar in the United States, following the combination of federal corn subsidies and sugar import tariffs that made domestic corn processing far more cost-effective than importing tropical cane sugar. The transition was gradual. The company blended the two sweeteners in shifting proportions over several years before completing the switch, and it was never announced publicly. By the time most American consumers noticed that something tasted slightly different, the transition was already complete, and the company had no particular interest in discussing it. The taste difference between high fructose corn syrup and cane sugar is real, but subtle, and whether it constitutes an improvement or a degradation depends significantly on individual palate and expectation. Fructose is sweeter than sucrose at the molecular level, which means high fructose corn syrup produces a sweetness that hits the palate slightly faster and slightly more intensely than cane sugar. Some tasters describe cane sugar Coke as having a cleaner, rounder sweetness that fades more gracefully. Others notice no difference at all. The food science is genuinely ambiguous, which has not prevented the debate from being conducted with enormous conviction on both sides. The glass bottle is a separate variable from the sweetener. Mexican Coke is served in the contoured glass bottle that American Coke abandoned for plastic and aluminum decades ago, and the glass genuinely affects the experience. Not because glass chemically alters the beverage, but because it chills more efficiently, maintains temperature longer, and the act of drinking from a glass bottle is physically and psychologically different from drinking from a can or a plastic bottle. When people say Mexican Coke tastes better, they're often tasting the combination of cane sugar, cold glass, and the slight oxygen interaction that occurs when carbonated liquid meets the specific surface geometry of that bottle's interior. It is a complete sensory package, not a single variable. Internationally, the variations go beyond sweetener. In Japan, Coca-Cola has been produced in flavors that would be unrecognizable in Atlanta. Sakura, green tea, and fiber-enriched versions have all appeared in the Japanese market, where consumer willingness to try novel flavor extensions is considerably higher than in Western markets. In India, the formula's sweetness level has been adjusted for local taste preferences. In parts of Africa, bottled Coca-Cola coexists with returnable glass bottle programs that have never disappeared, as they have in most Western markets, because the economics of bottle return make more sense in markets where packaging materials are expensive relative to labour. The product is the same formula everywhere. The experience of drinking it is determined by everything around the formula: the vessel, the temperature, the sweetener, the cultural context, which is a reminder that what we taste is never just what is in the glass. In downtown Atlanta, a few blocks from where John Pemberton stirred his brass kettle, there is a museum called the World of Coca-Cola. It is a remarkable place. Part brand shrine, part history exhibit, part elaborate sensory experience, and it draws over 1 million visitors a year. Near the entrance, installed with the ceremonial gravity of a national relic, is the vault. It is a large, gleaming, dramatically lit steel safe in which the company claims the written Coca-Cola formula is kept. You cannot open it. You cannot photograph the interior. You can stand in front of it, however, and absorb the mythology. The museum also contains a room called the Tasting Experience, in which visitors can sample over 100 Coca-Cola products from around the world, including some available nowhere else, and in which the Beverly, an Italian aperitif soda famously described as tasting like carbonated disappointment, has been defeating visitors for decades. It is a full experience. It cost about $20. Pemberton would have found it either deeply satisfying or completely baffling, possibly both. The museum opened in its current location in 2007, replacing an earlier, smaller version that had operated since 1990. It occupies a purpose-built facility of approximately 92,000 square feet, adjacent to Centennial Olympic Park, the park built for the 1996 Atlanta Olympics, where Coca-Cola was naturally an official sponsor. The building itself is designed to evoke the contoured Coca-Cola bottle in its exterior form, which is either architectural ingenuity or the most committed piece of product placement in the history of urban design, depending on your tolerance for corporate aesthetics. The vault was moved to the museum from the SunTrust Bank vault in Atlanta, where it had reportedly been stored for decades. The theatrical staging of the move, covered by local news, documented with the solemnity of a state occasion, reinforced the narrative that this was not a business document being relocated but a cultural artifact being enshrined. The vault itself is a custom-built structure that required months of installation. It is monitored, it is secured, and it contains, according to the company, the original handwritten formula, along with updated documentation reflecting changes to sourcing and processing over the years. Whether the formula in the vault is the actual complete working formula or a ceremonial document while the real operational recipe lives in a database somewhere in the company's technical operations division is a question that the company would prefer you not ask. What the vault provides is not security. Any company relying on a single physical document for the security of its most valuable intellectual property would be operating with extraordinary recklessness, but narrative. The vault is a story told in steel and glass, and it is an extremely effective one. The tasting experience room deserves its own appreciation, because it is the most democratically enjoyable part of the museum, and the part most likely to produce genuine surprise. The room contains soda dispensers offering Coca-Cola products from dozens of countries, many of which are entirely unavailable outside their home markets. The African selections tend to be sweeter and less carbonated than the American versions. The Asian selections are occasionally startling in their flavours, and the Beverly, an Italian bitter aperitif soda that Coca-Cola acquired through its Italian operations and occasionally brings back to the tasting experience for reasons that seem to combine genuine historical interest with mild corporate sadism, is reliably the most discussed product in the room. It is not good. It is aggressively, impressively, memorably not good. And yet it is perhaps the most honest thing in the building. A reminder that the Coca-Cola Company, for all its marketing genius, has occasionally produced things that taste exactly like what they are, which is a bitter Italian aperitif that was never meant to be sipped by tourists in Atlanta who were expecting something sweet. Here is where we end up. 139 years after a morphine-addicted pharmacist stirred a batch of syrup in his backyard and took it to a soda fountain. Coca-Cola is sold in every country on Earth except North Korea and Cuba, and that is primarily because of trade sanctions, not consumer indifference. The company operates in more than 200 countries. It produces over 500 brands. It sells approximately 2 billion servings per day. The logo is recognized by a higher percentage of the global population than almost any other image created by human beings. And the original formula, the one with the coca leaves, the cola nuts, the mysterious blend of oils, and the particular carbonated sweetness that somehow lodged itself permanently in the human brain's reward circuitry, is still being made, still being drunk, and still refusing to be replicated. What started as a patent medicine cure for a man's morphine addiction became, through ambition, marketing, secrecy, wars, lawsuits, and 79 catastrophic days in 1985, the most successful beverage in the history of civilization. History, it turns out, is sometimes a lot more interesting than the label lets on. The 2 billion daily servings figure deserves a moment of quiet contemplation. 2 billion is a number that resists meaningful visualization. It is larger than the population of any country except China and India, and it represents the number of individual moments per day in which a human being somewhere on Earth lifts a Coca-Cola product to their lips. Some of those people are drinking it in glass-walled offices in Tokyo. Some are drinking it at roadside stands in rural Nigeria. Some are drinking it at the kitchen table in small American towns that look exactly like the kind of place Asa Candler's salesman would have visited in 1893. The scale is genuinely planetary in a way that almost no other product in human history has achieved. The brand recognition statistics are equally vertiginous. Studies have consistently found that the Coca-Cola logo is recognized by somewhere between 94 and 97% of the global population, a figure that exceeds the recognition rate for any national flag, any religious symbol, and most political figures. It is recognized in communities that have no electricity and no reliable access to clean water, but have somehow been reached by Coca-Cola's distribution network and advertising presence. This is either a remarkable testament to the power of consistent, sustained branding over 139 years, or a somewhat unsettling commentary on the reach of commercial culture relative to basic infrastructure, depending on your perspective. Both things can be true simultaneously. The company has faced genuine criticism throughout its history, for its labour practices in certain international markets, for its water usage in drought-affected regions, for its role in the global obesity crisis, and for its aggressive lobbying against sugar taxes and beverage regulations. These criticisms are not trivial, and they are not invented. A product consumed by 2 billion people daily at the scale of sweetness that Coca-Cola represents has genuine public health implications that the company has, at various points, addressed with a combination of reformulation, legal resistance, and the kind of deeply funded public relations effort that tends to produce the impression of engagement without the substance of change. And yet, John Pemberton, dying broke in Atlanta in 1888, stirred something in that brass kettle that the world has been unable to put down for 139 years. He was trying to cure his addiction. He accidentally created one. And the thing he created has outlasted empires, survived prohibition, navigated 2 world wars, weathered a catastrophic formula change, and continued to be drunk in enormous quantities by people who have no idea that the coca leaves in their soda are being processed by a chemical company in New Jersey under a federal narcotics license, which is either the most impressive commercial achievement in human history or the most elaborate practical joke, or possibly both. Let's address something that gets brought up at every holiday party by the one person who just discovered it and cannot stop talking about it. Did Coca-Cola invent the modern image of Santa Claus? The short answer is no, but the longer answer is so much more interesting and involves a Swedish-American illustrator, a deeply contested piece of advertising history, and the fact that Coca-Cola's marketing department was so relentlessly effective that it managed to take partial credit for an entire global mythological figure. The man at the centre of this story is Hatton Sundblom, a commercial artist hired by Coca-Cola in 1931 to paint a series of holiday advertisements featuring Santa Claus drinking Coke. What Sundblom painted was warm, round, rosy-cheeked and red-suited, and it was everywhere, for decades, every winter, in every magazine, on every billboard, in every pharmacy and department store in America. Whether he invented that image or simply amplified one that already existed is the question historians have been pleasantly arguing about ever since. The historical record on Santa's appearance before 1931 is considerably more varied than the Coca-Cola story suggests. Santa Claus, derived from the Dutch Sinterklaas, who was himself derived from St. Nicholas of Myra, had been depicted in American popular culture since the early 19th century. Thomas Nast, the political cartoonist, published illustrations of Santa in Harper's Weekly from 1863 onward that showed him as a round, jolly, fur-suited figure, unmistakably the precursor to the modern image. Nast's Santa wore a variety of colours but frequently appeared in red-trimmed garments, and had the broad build and white beard that we now consider definitive. This was 68 years before Sundblom painted his first Coca-Cola Christmas advertisement. What Sundblom did was not invent the image, but standardise it with a specificity and warmth that no previous version had achieved. His Santa was not a cartoon or a sketch. It was a fully realised photorealistic oil painting of a specific believable man, rendered with the technical skill of a master illustrator in the peak tradition of American commercial art. The model for Sundblom's Santa was initially a retired Coca-Cola salesman named Lou Prentice, and after Prentice died, Sundblom used his own face in the mirror as reference. The resulting image had an intimacy and a humanity that earlier Santas lacked. This was not a symbol, this was a person, a large, cheerful, red-suited person who apparently had excellent taste in soft drinks. Coca-Cola ran these advertisements every Christmas from 1931 until 1964, 33 consecutive years of the same warm, consistent, meticulously painted image appearing in the most widely read magazines in America. The cumulative effect of that repetition on the cultural image of Santa Claus cannot be overstated. Even if Sundblom had not invented the red-suited rotund Santa, he had certainly cemented it, made it so dominant, so universally expected, that alternative depictions began to feel wrong. The Coca-Cola Santa did not replace competing images by force. He simply appeared every Christmas for 3 decades in 30 million living rooms, and the other Santas gradually faded. The company, to its credit, does not officially claim to have invented Santa's appearance, but it does, in its museum and its official history, frame Sundblom's work as transformative, which is accurate, and the popular myth that Coca-Cola invented the modern Santa persists, partly because it is a good story, and partly because it is not entirely false. They did not invent him, but they did, in a very meaningful commercial and cultural sense, finish him. One of the most underappreciated business decisions in Coca-Cola's history happened almost by accident. When those 2 lawyers from Chattanooga approached Asa Candler in 1899 and offered him $1 for the rights to bottle and sell Coca-Cola, Candler handed it over because he genuinely did not believe bottled soda would become significant. What he had accidentally created and what would be refined and systematized over the following decades was one of the most powerful franchise models in the history of commerce. The Coca-Cola Company would manufacture and sell syrup. Independent bottlers would purchase that syrup, add carbonated water, put it in bottles or cans and distribute it locally. The company controlled the product. The bottlers controlled the infrastructure, and as a result, Coca-Cola expanded into markets, regions and countries without having to build a single factory of its own. It was an empire that grew by multiplication rather than construction, and it made the Coca-Cola Company extraordinarily rich, while also making a quietly staggering number of local bottling entrepreneurs equally wealthy. The elegance of the bottler model lies in what economists call risk transfer. When an independent bottler signs a franchise agreement with Coca-Cola, They take on the capital costs of building or leasing a bottling facility, purchasing the carbonation and filling equipment, maintaining a vehicle fleet for distribution, and managing the local workforce. If the bottling operation fails, the bottler bears that loss. If it succeeds, the bottler profits. But so does Coca-Cola, which receives syrup revenue regardless of how efficiently or inefficiently any individual bottler runs their operation. The company sits at the top of the supply chain in a position of almost pure leverage. It controls the one input that no bottler can produce or substitute, and it collects revenue from every bottle sold without bearing the operational risks of the local business. The relationship between the Coca-Cola company and its bottlers has not always been harmonious. The original contracts that Thomas and Whitehead negotiated in 1899 fixed the price of syrup at a flat rate indefinitely, a provision that became catastrophically disadvantageous for the company during periods of high sugar prices. Asa Candler's successors spent years attempting to renegotiate these contracts, eventually reaching agreements in the 1920s that gave the company more pricing flexibility, but the legal battles involved were expensive, protracted, and occasionally bitter. A company that was generating revenues of tens of millions of dollars annually was bound by contracts that had been written when it was generating revenues of thousands. The modern bottler network is considerably more consolidated than its historical predecessor. In the early 20th century, there were hundreds of small independent Coca-Cola bottlers, family businesses in small towns, regional operations covering a few counties, local entrepreneurs who had signed franchise agreements, and built modest but sustainable businesses around the Coca-Cola name. Over the course of the 20th century, through acquisition, consolidation, and the economies of scale that made large regional bottlers vastly more efficient than small local ones, this network has been rationalized into a much smaller number of very large bottling companies. In North America, Coca-Cola Consolidated is the largest independent Coca-Cola bottler, serving a territory that covers portions of more than 20 states. The era of the small-town family bottler is largely over. The model, however, endures, and the fundamental insight that animated it, that a company can achieve planetary scale by controlling the recipe while letting others build the infrastructure, remains one of the most powerful ideas in the history of commercial enterprise. While the cocaine was being quietly removed from Coca-Cola's formula in the early 1900s, another story was unfolding in operating rooms across the world, one in which cocaine was not being villainized but celebrated, because it turns out cocaine has a genuinely extraordinary medical application that has nothing to do with recreation. Karl Koller, an Austrian ophthalmologist, discovered in 1884 that cocaine was an extraordinarily effective topical anesthetic, specifically that when applied to the surface of the eye, it numbed it completely without requiring the patient to be rendered unconscious. This was a revelation. Eye surgery before local anesthesia was, by any reasonable measure, a nightmare. Cocaine made it possible to operate on an awake cooperative patient whose eye felt nothing. From there, cocaine's use spread to dental procedures, throat surgeries, and nasal operations. To this day, cocaine hydrochloride remains a legal, Schedule II controlled substance used in certain ear, nose, and throat procedures, making it the only illegal recreational drug that is also a legitimate, irreplaceable surgical tool. Koller's discovery arrived at a moment when surgery was in the middle of a revolution. Ether and chloroform general anesthesia had been available since the 1840s, transforming surgery from something patients had to be physically restrained for into a procedure they could sleep through. But general anesthesia carried its own risks: respiratory depression, cardiac complications, the hazards of dosing a patient to unconsciousness with a substance whose margin between effective dose and fatal dose was not enormous. For procedures on the head and face, general anesthesia was particularly complicated because the anesthesiologist needed access to the airway, while the surgeon needed access to the same general region of the body. Cocaine solved this problem elegantly. Applied topically, dropped into the eye, sprayed into the nose, swabbed onto the throat, it numbed the surface tissue completely within minutes, without affecting consciousness, without requiring inhalation of any substance, and with a duration of effect that could be timed to the length of the procedure. A patient undergoing eye surgery under cocaine anesthesia could follow instructions, report discomfort, and maintain their own airway throughout. The surgery was precise, the patient was safe, and the cocaine was doing exactly what it was supposed to do, blocking the sodium channels in nerve cell membranes so that pain signals could not be transmitted to the brain. Sigmund Freud, whose 1884 paper on cocaine had contributed to its early medical enthusiasm, was actually tangentially connected to Koller's discovery. They were colleagues at the Vienna General Hospital at the time, and Freud had been experimenting with cocaine's potential as an anesthetic before Koller made the ophthalmological breakthrough. Freud missed the discovery because he left Vienna to visit his fiancée while Koller conducted the decisive experiments. It is one of the minor footnotes of medical history that the man most associated with cocaine's early medical promotion did not get credit for its most genuinely useful application. Modern cocaine hydrochloride solution, used in surgery today, is a carefully controlled pharmaceutical product bearing almost no resemblance to the recreational cocaine market. It is manufactured to pharmaceutical standards, dispensed by licensed medical professionals, and used in concentrations and quantities calibrated for specific surgical applications. The fact that it shares a name and a chemical structure with an illegal drug is simply a result of history. Cocaine was a legitimate medical substance before it was a controlled one, and its medical utility did not disappear when its recreational use became illegal. It simply became, like several other Schedule II substances, a drug that requires a great deal of paperwork to use legitimately, which is perhaps the most fitting possible ending for a substance that once flavoured the world's most popular soft drink. When Coca-Cola launched Tab in 1963, its first Diet Cola, sweetened with saccharin and marketed almost exclusively to women who were concerned about their figures, it accidentally stumbled into one of the most revealing case studies in 20th century consumer psychology. Tab was successful. Tab was also deeply, intentionally gendered in a way that the company would spend the next 2 decades wrestling with, because there was an enormous, untapped market of men who wanted a low-calorie cola, but would not, under any circumstances, be seen drinking something marketed to women. The solution, launched in 1982, was Diet Coke, a product deliberately presented as sophisticated, urban and gender-neutral, with advertising that featured not weight loss messaging, but imagery of desirability, aspiration, and what the 1980s understood as cool. It became the 3rd best-selling soft drink in the world within a year of its launch. It also used a different formula from Coca-Cola Classic, which meant the company now had 2 flagship cola products with 2 different flavour profiles coexisting in the same market, which created the kind of internal complexity that keeps marketing departments employed indefinitely. Tab's history is a precise artifact of its era. The name was chosen through a computer program designed to generate short, memorable words. The company wanted something with no existing associations, a blank slate onto which consumers could project whatever they wished. The marketing that followed was anything but blank. Tab advertisements featured slim, attractive women in the language of aspirational femininity that permeated 1960s American advertising. The suggestion that drinking Tab was part of a lifestyle of elegance, discipline, and attractiveness. The product was positioned not as a health choice, but as a beauty choice, which was a marketing distinction with real consequences for who would and would not buy it. The saccharin in Tab carried its own problems. In 1977, The Food and Drug Administration proposed banning saccharin after studies showed it caused bladder cancer in rats at extremely high doses, doses equivalent to a human drinking 800 cans of tab per day, which is a level of consumption that raises questions beyond saccharin toxicity. The proposed ban was met with enormous public backlash from tab drinkers, who lobbied Congress with what the New York Times described as unusual intensity for a food additive regulation. Congress responded by requiring warning labels rather than an outright ban, and tab survived, though the saccharin controversy permanently dented its commercial momentum. Diet Coke, launched 1982, was a genuinely different product in ways that went beyond its name. It used a formula distinct from both Coca-Cola Classic and Tab, developed to maximize flavor in the absence of sugar in a way that neither its predecessors had achieved. It was sweetened with aspartame rather than saccharin, which produced a substantially more pleasant flavor profile. And its marketing was a deliberate departure from Tab's feminine coding. Diet Coke advertisements featured the famous construction worker advertisement, in which a group of office women ogle an attractive man who removes his shirt while drinking a Diet Coke, inverting the usual dynamic of gendered beverage advertising, with a knowingness that was, for 1982, quite sophisticated. The message was clear. Diet Coke was not for people who were worried about their weight. It was for people who had good taste. The distinction was commercially decisive, and it opened the low-calorie cola market to a male consumer base that Tab had never been able to reach. Let's close this particular door the way it deserves to be closed, by imagining John Stith Pemberton, pharmacist, veteran, inventor, addict, an accidental architect of one of the most profitable enterprises in human history, transported forward in time to the present day, and deposited, confused and overwhelmed, in the middle of Times Square in New York City. The first thing he would see, almost certainly, is a Coca-Cola advertisement, probably a large one, possibly illuminated. He would recognize the logo, which has remained remarkably consistent with his original design. He would not recognize the bottle. He would be baffled by the can. He would be genuinely alarmed by the diet version, the zero sugar version, the cherry version, the Starlight Limited edition, and whatever seasonal collaboration the marketing department has most recently produced. He would have no framework for the concept of a global brand, no mental model for 2 billion daily servings, and absolutely no way to process the world of Coca-Cola Museum with its theatrical vault and its room full of international sodas. But if you handed him a cold glass of original Coca-Cola over ice, the way they still serve it at some old-fashioned soda fountains, there is every reason to believe he would take one sip and recognize it immediately. Because that part, underneath everything, the formula, the taste, the particular pleasure of it, has never really changed. The Times Square billboard alone would require considerable time to process. Pemberton lived in a world where advertising meant a notice in a newspaper or a painted sign on a building, static, local, modest in scale. The concept of an illuminated display the size of a building face, cycling through moving images at a cost per day that would exceed his annual income many times over, in a location seen by hundreds of thousands of people every hour, would be not just unfamiliar but genuinely incomprehensible. The scale of it, the brightness, the motion, these would be astonishing before he even registered what was being advertised. That his product was the subject of such a display would, one imagines, require a very long sit-down. The can would confuse him profoundly. The aluminum beverage can, taken for granted by everyone alive today, is a remarkable piece of engineering. A container that maintains carbonation under pressure, requires no opener in its modern pull-tab form, weighs almost nothing, and can be produced and filled at speeds approaching 1,000 units per minute on modern canning lines. Pemberton, who bottled and sold his first year's supply of syrup from a jug, would have no cognitive framework for this object. He might tap it. He might smell it. He might cautiously open it and drink from it, at which point the experience of familiar flavour from an entirely alien vessel would be perhaps the most disorienting moment of his entire temporal displacement. The zero sugar version would be philosophically troubling to him. Pemberton's entire theory of his product rested on its active ingredients: the coca extract, the cola extract, the essential oils. The idea of a version that contained none of the sugar that carried those flavours, sweetened instead by aspartame and racesulfame potassium, two compounds that did not exist during his lifetime, and marketed as delivering the same experience as his original formula, would raise questions about the nature of his invention that he might find difficult to answer. Was it the formula? Was it the experience? Was it the idea of the thing? And if a synthetic version could deliver the same experience, what exactly had he invented? But then someone would hand him that glass. Coca-Cola, over ice, in a proper glass, the way Venable served it at Jacob's Pharmacy in May of 1886. And whatever else has changed about the world, whatever is unrecognisable in the Times Square chaos, and the aluminum and the zero sugar variants, that first sip would land in a brain that knew it. The flavour, the carbonation, the slight bitterness at the back of the palate, the sweetness that does not quite overwhelm. All of it the same as it was on the day he brought a jug of syrup to a pharmacy on Peachtree Street and watched strangers drink it and come back for more. He made something that the world could not put down. He died before he knew it, and it has been going ever since. And so, here we are, at the end of a story that began in a backyard in Atlanta with a brass kettle, a morphine addiction, and a man who thought he was making medicine. John Pemberton never got to see what he built. He died broke, in pain, in the summer of 1888, having sold away the last of his claim to a formula that would go on to outlast empires, survive Prohibition, navigate 2 world wars, and become the most recognised commercial product in the history of human civilization. He was trying to feel better. He accidentally gave the whole world something to reach for, and the world kept reaching. Through soda fountains and glass bottles and aluminum cans and plastic cups at stadium concession stands. Through wars and lawsuits and 79 catastrophic days in 1985. Through the quiet removal of the cocaine, the not-so-quiet retention of the coca leaves, and the steady, relentless hum of 2 billion daily servings that continues right now, as you listen to this, somewhere on every continent on the planet. There is something worth pausing on in all of that. Not the scale is almost too large to feel anything about, but the stubbornness of it. The refusal of this particular combination of flavours and carbonation and sweetness to be forgotten, replaced or improved upon in any way that sticks. People have tried. Brilliant, well-funded, extensively researched people have tried, and every time the world has looked at the alternative and quietly gone back to the original. There is something almost mysterious about that kind of durability, something that resists full explanation by chemistry or marketing or brand theory alone. Maybe it is simply that Pemberton, in that backyard, stumbled onto something that sits in a very particular place in the human sensory experience, a place that, once found, is almost impossible to unfind, a flavour memory that, once formed, becomes part of the architecture of comfort, the smell of it opening, the sound of the carbonation settling, the specific cold of it against the back of the throat on a warm afternoon. These are not grand experiences, they are small ones, but the small ones are often the ones that last. So tonight, as you settle into whatever comfortable surface you have chosen for this particular evening, your bed, your couch, your chair with the good cushion, maybe spare a quiet thought for the pharmacist in Atlanta who was just trying to get through the day, who mixed something in a kettle and tasted it and thought, yes, that's it. not knowing that it was the beginning of something so large that 139 years later, a person on the other side of the planet would be listening to its story in the dark and thinking about the can in the refrigerator. History is full of accidents that turned out to matter enormously. Full of people who were trying to solve a small problem and inadvertently solved something much larger, or created something much stranger, or set in motion a chain of events that their own imagination could never have contained. Pemberton was one of those people. His problem was personal and painful and very ordinary. His solution was, against all reasonable probability, eternal. Sleep well. And if you wake up in the night with a craving you cannot quite explain, that particular sweetness, that particular fizz, well, now you know where it comes from. Good night.